It's the doomsday scenario of the modern age. Global warming causing the ice caps to melt, in turn causing sea levels to rise. As a result, hundreds of thousands could die and millions could be forced to move inland. Hollywood has already painted a vivid picture of what may await us, but are we letting our fears get the best of us? Is a global warming doomsday a foregone conclusion? And if not, is there anything we can realistically do to intervene? Coming up next on Great Decisions, we'll tackle the climate change debate.
In a democracy, agreement is not essential, but participation is. Join us as we discuss today's most critical global issues. Join us for Great Decisions. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association, inspiring Americans to learn more about the world.
Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Starr Foundation, the Morse Family Foundation, the William and Karen Tell Foundation, and U.S. Trust.
And now from our New York studios, here is Ralph Beglatter.
The numbers don't lie. The planet's temperature has steadily risen over the last century at record speeds. And many scientists warn that the outcome of this warming could be flooding in some areas, droughts in others, and the drowning of coastal cities from Bangladesh to New York and London. This rise in temperature is generally attributed to elevated greenhouse gas emissions. Beginning with the Industrial Revolution, humans have released more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year, and the United States emits the most. China and India are moving up fast as they develop into industrial societies. But there are some scientists who argue that humans are not responsible for the temperature rise, at least not entirely. They say it's all part of a natural cycle of peaks and valleys. Others say it's because of an unusually high level of solar activity. Still others say there's not enough data to make a meaningful comparison. There are international efforts to limit greenhouse gas emissions. 157 countries have signed the Kyoto Protocol, pledging to reduce emissions voluntarily. The Bush administration has rejected the agreement, arguing that the treaty is flawed, since China and India are exempt because they're developing nations. But would even the Kyoto Treaty have enough impact to stop the warming trend? And what would it mean for the U.S. economy? Though the Bush administration has questioned the existence and cause of global warming, the vast majority of scientists say the Earth is getting hotter and we're the ones causing it, with our cars, trucks, power plants, and factories. Is there anything ordinary citizens can do to stop the warming trend? What if everybody drove a hybrid car and every house were solar powered? What if we switched from coal to nuclear electricity? Would that be enough to slow it down and save our coastlines? Or are we already too far gone? With us to help answer these and other questions are Dr. Ralph Cicerone, President of the National Academy of Sciences, and Dr. James Hansen, Director of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies. Thank you both for being with us.
Great to be here.
Is it fair at this point, by now in the debate, to say that within the scientific community anyway, there's no longer any debate over whether global warming is actually occurring? Jim?
Yeah, it is clear. Because the world has been warming so rapidly in the last 30 years. It's warmed about 1/3 of a degree Fahrenheit each decade for 3 decades now. And the thermometers at the weather stations and the satellites all show the same thing. The world is really getting warmer.
Okay, Ralph, any thoughts on that?
I agree. The warming is happening virtually everywhere, and the rate is really fast.
Okay, so whether it's happening is no longer a debate.
Right.
What's the cause is the debate, right?
Right, but we should point out, 1 degree Fahrenheit is small compared to weather fluctuations, and so the person in the street often is confused. They mistake the short-term fluctuations for long-term change. But 1 degree is important on a global average.
Is there anything that ordinary people on the street actually can observe that would verify this?
Yes, they can look at the frequency of warmer than normal seasons, and that has increased from 30% 30 years ago to about 60% now. So if you're willing to integrate the temperature and just notice, was this season warmer than average, you'll find that more often than not it is.
So we've got global warming. What's causing it? Is that where the debate is? Or is there no debate over that either?
There's not really much debate over that either in the scientific community. There are, of course, the nature of science is to be skeptical. Whenever you offer any explanation for anything, all scientists are going to question that. And there are some people who question that, and there are natural causes of climate change as well as man-made. But it's pretty clear that the largest forcing mechanism that's driving this global change is the increasing greenhouse gases that people are putting into the atmosphere.
Okay. In the academy, is that true too? No debate in the academy among scientists?
There's still debate, but it's decreasing. The longer that this warming trend continues at this rapid rate, the fact that all of the data are aligning, for example, the rate at which ice is melting has now been measured with so many different techniques, and the rate is increasing. The rate at which sea level is rising is being measured better than it used to be, and it's faster than it used to be. People are seeing things happening in the Arctic that are actually faster than we'd predicted. They're hearing sounds out of the ice. They're seeing ice movements and flows of water out of melting ice. People are seeing things that are way beyond the bounds of normality that we were familiar with. So the numbers are switching to how many people who think that humans are causing it and it's unnatural. The numbers have tilted way over to more belief in that. Most of us started out saying, not going to see it in our lifetimes. Most of us are changing our mind.
That you'll see it in our lifetime?
That we're seeing it now.
Okay. I was going to ask you about those observable things. We read stories about, I was actually in Antarctica with students at the time that big ice shelf broke off a couple of years ago, and you read stories about polar bears in the Arctic that can't get to their fishing grounds and so on. These seem like anecdotal things, but are there enough of them to be able to say that you're seeing concrete evidence of what you've observed scientifically?
For example, on sea level rise, years and years ago, the data would basically be taken at different coastal locations with sticks in the ground. Now they're being taken not only that way, more extensively, but with satellites covering the entire Earth. And while there are some places where sea level isn't rising as fast due to local geology, generally speaking, sea level is rising everywhere.
There are some people who say, though, that because we now have better measuring equipment, we've got satellites, we've got photographs, we've got more sophisticated sensors, we've got more of them, more sensors in more places. There are people who say, well, naturally you're going to get more data, and naturally it's going to look worse, but it's only because back in the day we didn't have all that stuff.
Well, let me give you an example where the opposite is true. This past 30 years that Jim mentioned a few years ago is unique for another reason. It's the first time in human history that we've measured the sun well enough, precisely enough, to see whether the sun is sending more energy to the planet, maybe warming us up. Because that was one of the best ideas early on, that maybe this is a natural warming caused by the sun. Well, it turns out it isn't true. The sun is not heating up. The sun is not giving us any more energy, and those precise measurements have allowed it. But, a lot of the evidence is based on instruments, things that you cannot still see or smell or feel. And that's the way it was with the ozone layer too. We had to measure things. We couldn't immediately see skin cancers. We had to go on the basis of measurements of things that you couldn't see.
That's the most difficult thing about this problem because of the large natural variability of climate, weather and climate. It's difficult for people to notice that something's changing. But when you average over the planet, you see that it's really a very unusual change. This rate of warming in the last 30 years, we don't see that any time in the preceding record.
Now, let's move beyond the questions over the science and talk to where do we go from here. We've gotten to point A, apparently, which is we've concluded this phenomenon is occurring. How do we get to point B now, which is what do we do about it, and are we able to actually do anything about it?
Well, I think we're able to do something about it if we recognize the issue. And that's the problem, because I think there's a big gap between understanding of global warming and knowledge of it. And I mean understanding by the scientific community and what is known by the people who need to know, and that's the public and the policymakers. Because we're going to need to begin to make changes, I think, within a decade, significant changes, or else the climate changes will be very large and some things will become out of our control.
So this is an education phenomenon at this point.
Right.
How do you persuade people? They don't understand the measurements you're talking about.
Well, one thing is, it used to be said that, well, this is based on climate models, and, we're not sure we can trust those. But a lot of our understanding is based on looking at the history of the Earth. And we've already increased the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from 280 parts per million to 380 parts per million. And if we look at the history of the Earth and how sensitive the climate is to changes in atmospheric composition, we conclude that, boy, we had better try to keep CO2 from exceeding something like 450 parts per million. And to do that, we're going to have to start slowing down the rate of emissions very soon.
And maybe we should go back just a little bit where all this is coming from. The principal cause that we're worried about is the increase in carbon dioxide, but a few other chemicals in the air that have the same properties. Carbon dioxide is the dominant one. That's coming from our use of fossil fuels. The burning of coal and oil and natural gas and gasoline, even wood and charcoal, releases CO2 in the very act of releasing the energy that we wanted in the first place. There's no way to dodge it unless you burn a fuel that doesn't have carbon in it. And then some of it's coming from agriculture, the raising of sheep and cows and rice paddies and clearing of land to create agricultural land. Well, energy and agriculture are pretty essential. So some people who don't know what to do are saying, you know, there's no way to interfere with human usage of energy and production of foods. That's just too essential. But we have to find ways. And I think the first place to start is energy efficiency. There's lots of incentives here, both in rich countries and in poorer countries, to become more energy efficient. So that's where I would start to get from point A to point B here.
Can you be concrete about that? Is there something I can do as an individual? Is driving a hybrid car going to make much of a difference? That's not where most of the CO2 is produced, is it? It's in energy production. It's in power plants and things
transportation, like that. The driving of cars and buses and trucks and trains and airplanes is a third or 40%. Is that about it in the U.S., Jim?
Yeah.
Yeah, a third to 40%.
It is important. Individuals can reduce their carbon emissions by a substantial fraction, and that will have to be part of the solution. But it's important to recognize that we have to have government leadership on this, because if we simply have individuals reducing their use, that just reduces the price of the fossil fuel and somebody else will burn it. But the truth is, we're going to have to slow down the rate of emission of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And I think the only way that's going to happen is if you have a price on carbon emissions. We're going to have a gradually increasing price, and in doing that, that will drive the efficiency, that will drive the development of new technologies that use much less fuel or use alternative fuels that don't produce carbon dioxide. But we've got to have some government leadership in getting those things to happen.
Now you're getting into the political part of the story, which is an important one, too. People are already complaining about increasing prices of gasoline, increasing prices of natural gas, home heating fuel, and so on. What politician is going to step up there, what political leader, like the one you were just talking about, and say, we're going to raise taxes, we're going to increase double the price of gasoline
But we're not going to do it instantly. We're going to do it gradually, and so that the consumer will have the option of using more efficient vehicles, using the hybrid vehicle. And those consumers who do better than the average will actually save money. You can have a revenue-neutral tax in which is slowly increasing, but at the same time you're driving the innovation so that the technologies are available to use less fuel.
I'm not arguing against a tax and incentive program, but from an incentive point of view in business, I think there really are a lot of incentives. For example, you mentioned a hybrid car, Ralph. A lot of the solution has to come from technology being available to satisfy the demand. There is a market both in rich countries where we use most of the energy and therefore we're spending a lot of money on energy, and in poor countries who have trouble affording energy for their development when oil prices are northward of $50 a barrel. It's impeding their development. So there are markets everywhere. And I think it is going to take government leadership, and I think it's also going to take demand for new products and businesses who see a real incentive here, and there are incentives. We've got all kinds of corporations in the U.S. right now and worldwide who are jumping on energy efficiency as a way to grow their businesses.
What is you spoke about the rich countries and the poor countries. Let's talk about that for a second. What's the incentive in a poor country that's largely agricultural, let's say, which is looking at developing itself and saying, wait a minute, I want a power plant. I want to have people driving cars. I want to have lots of roads. And you guys did it in the rich world. Don't ask me now to not do things that you've already done.
Well, that's why the developed countries do need to take the first steps. But fortunately, if you want to use the word that way, the developing countries will probably suffer the most from climate change if we allow it to really spin out of control.
Why?
Because India, China, Bangladesh have huge areas where large populations that would be underwater when sea level goes up, for example. And they're at latitudes where they're already quite warm. So the additional warming with global warming would be particularly have an impact there.
And that extra warming and the need to move water around is going to increase their needs for electricity and water, which is going to impede their development and also cause more pollution problems. But the reason I think Jim says that the leading countries like the U.S. really do have an extra responsibility is that we're better equipped right now. We have more highly educated people. We have more technological know-how. We have more capital. We have to be providing information to allow other countries to help to discern their own options, and then we have to help them to provide technology to solve their problems, and I think that's where the incentives are for our businesses.
That's true, but I found in talking to Chinese and Indian people that they're actually quite informed on this sort of thing, and I think they will be willing to cooperate if we would step up to the plate.
Let me ask you to put yourselves for a moment in the shoes of a politician or a business executive, a CEO of a company. Both of those, and you've both spoken about incentives for business and incentives for government, both of those officials are responsive to short-term demands from their customers, if you will. Politicians respond to voters who vote next week in an election or next month in an election or something like that. Mm-hmm. And CEOs respond to shareholders who don't care very much about what the share price is going to be 50 years from now, but they're worried about their investment for next month, next year, when they retire, et cetera. They're pretty short term. What's the incentive for you now in those executive positions to respond to a demand that you say is at least a decade away?
I think there's an incentive in both cases. The politicians, occasionally there are politicians who are willing to take the long view, and history judges them kindly. I'm hoping that we can come up with some of those politicians. But in the case of the businesses, it's really even 6-month profits may be affected negatively by making investments in more efficient technology. But even on a relatively short time scale, you can see what's happening to our automakers. They're not able to compete well with Japanese companies who are emphasizing efficiency.
But the American automakers have not learned that lesson. They've had ample decades to learn it.
Yeah. I think they'd better start to learn it pretty soon, or they won't be around.
On the face of it, Ralph, I think we do have a really tough problem because you have the quarterly emphasis of stockholders and analysts that hurt companies, and politicians have a 2 or 4 year time horizon. So on the surface of it, it is pretty grim. But I think Jim's right. There are some people who take the longer term. There's some other incentives. For example, there are some corporations in different sectors that have to plan many years ahead. Forestry, agriculture, shipping, people who are doing coastal development, and they can in turn create the market for energy efficient products, and that market is going to tap into other countries. Just as a few examples. This conversation gets pretty wide-ranging because what we're talking about is there's no simple solution. We have to do a lot of things very well, which in combination will work. There is no magic bullet here. Like somebody might say, well, let's have hydrogen fuels, and they don't understand where the hydrogen comes from. Or somebody who says we'll get all our electricity from nuclear. That's not always practical. We have to do a lot of things well.
Jim's given us the example of the automakers, the Japanese makers, for example, who have seen this coming, have seen a market for it, and have moved in the right direction. But there are plenty of examples also, Medicare, health care, Social Security problems in just the United States, to name a few, where politicians have known about these problems for decades, that this is something that's coming down the road a few decades from now, and have repeatedly stepped up to the plate and then not taken a swing at it. You're a scientist. How do you talk to these politicians? How do you get them to do it?
it's just become so acute now. I mean, a good example is the fact that our dependence on oil from foreign sources. We should have seen that coming. We've seen it coming for decades.
Yeah, we've seen it since the 70s.
And we could deal with it if we put a price on the carbon emissions and improved our efficiencies. The benefits in reductions in our balance of payments deficit and our reduction in requirements for defending sources of oil would be enormous. And I think a number of people can see that. I think the public is a lot smarter than than politicians give them credit for. If they would really be honest with the public, I think they would be willing to step up to make the changes that are needed.
Is this a partisan issue? And it doesn't really matter which side it's on, but if Party A is on one side, then Party B is going to oppose it and vice versa?
No, I don't think so. At the high levels, it's been that way recently, but I think in Congress right now, it's become either bipartisan or nonpartisan. For example, I've seen a number of Democrats recently who are starting to work with businesses towards solutions of the energy problems. And I know there are a lot of Republicans in Congress who take the issue seriously. I think Jim's example of foreign oil dependence is one of the big drivers right now, that people are realizing even though climate change is a long-term issue, we can buy part of a solution to it by dealing with this other long-term issue, foreign oil, which has all of a sudden hit us in the face. Maybe not all of a sudden.
Great Decisions spoke with Timothy Wirth, former senator from Colorado and president of the United Nations Foundation, about the future of climate change and the American political arena.
The U.S. has to be on board any kind of international agreement, and what happens post-Kyoto is the $64 question. That's going to be a commitment of whoever becomes the new president, sworn in January of 2009. This has to be right at the top of the agenda. Fortunately, it appears that every major candidate, Republican and Democrat, is deeply committed to making changes in the climate area.
And if you assume that it's bipartisan, if you assume that it's nonpartisan at least, does that give you hope that the quick moves necessary, Jim talked about we've got to do it in a decade, is going to be possible in our political system?
I think it's possible, but we should be concerned about the huge influence that special interests have had on our government. There are companies that feel their short-term interests are not served by beginning to address this problem. And I think it needs to become clear that the public interest does not coincide with that of some of these special interests.
And what special interests are you talking about?
Well, in the case of vehicle efficiency, we have automobile companies suing California in court for their attempt to make their vehicles 30% more efficient. But the National Research Council has said we have a technology right now for vehicles to be 30% more efficient. If we did that throughout the United States, it would save $150 billion a year in our oil imports. So it's crazy, but they just feel that they're making more money on the big SUVs, so they don't want to make that change.
Oil industry too, or not?
Oil industry too, absolutely. And the coal industry.
Those are powerful interests.
Absolutely.
And I don't know that you've been very persuasive as scientists to get those interests turned around.
That's why the public has to be informed, and the policymakers, the politicians, have got to pay attention to what the national long-term best interest is.
There was a success story in this arena that always strikes me, the ozone issue, where the scientific community demonstrated the problem, figured out the answer, and managed to successfully persuade societies all around the world, really, including the most developed ones, to take the steps necessary. And now it's not solved, but it's on its way to being solved. Can that model be repeated in the case of global warming?
Well, that was the intention of the Kyoto Protocol, was to be analogous to the Montreal Protocol. The difference is that in the case of chlorofluorocarbons, which needed to be phased out, the company that was most affected saw that it could develop alternatives and still make just as much money or more, and so they stopped opposing it. After a few years, they stopped opposing it.
Well, there was government leadership involved there, too.
Right.
President Reagan made a decision to go ahead and initiate international discussions that led to the phase-out of the CFCs before our chemical companies were ready to produce the substitutes. And they had to get on board And I think President Reagan deserves a great deal of credit for that leadership, because afterwards our chemical companies said, okay, we can produce substitutes. So in your car air conditioner now, you're using a slightly revised version of the Freon type chemical that used to be in car air conditioners.
Ralph Cicerone, president of the National Academy of Sciences, and Jim Hansen, director of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies. Thank you both for being with us on Great Decisions. And thank you as well for joining us on Great Decisions 2007. I'm Ralph Begleiter.
To learn more about topics discussed on Great Decisions, visit our website at www.greatdecisions.org. To order a copy of the Great Decisions Briefing Book, a DVD set of this series, or to join a Great Decisions discussion group in your area, contact the Foreign Policy Association. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation, the Morse Family Foundation, the William and Karen Tell Foundation, and U.S. Trust.